seventh episode with the Shoebats of Unlocking Mystery Babylon. This is Ted and Walid Shoebat at Shoebat.com. Ted, if you want to start us off tonight with what you're seeing in the world and break it down for us.
Yeah, well, there's a number of things that have been taking place and a number of really interesting pieces of information about what we can expect to see in this decade, actually. It's very interesting. Last month, I did a video on coronavirus in Sweden. Sweden is pretty much the only country in Europe that refused to do any sort of lockdown. The government of Sweden said that you can do a voluntary quarantine, but there's going to be no enforced lockdown of any sort. And a lot of anti-lockdown activists and talkers praised Sweden for this. The head epidemiologist of Sweden, Anders Tegnell, he was the pioneer of this whole policy, and he was praised as some sort of a hero against the one world order, the new world order, and Bill Gates and the people who want to enforce vaccinations on everyone. And it turned out that Norway had the biggest death toll amongst Sweden's Scandinavian neighbors. Denmark, Norway, Finland, these countries all did lockdowns and had pretty low death tolls. But Sweden so far has a death toll of over 5,000 people. And this made me very suspicious because, for one thing, Sweden has a very long history of eugenics. And secondly, because Sweden was, and still is, deliberately depriving elderly people of medical care.
Yes.
Deliberately depriving elderly people of oxygen machines. And if you look at the eugenic history of Sweden, Sweden started a eugenic policy going all the way back to the early 1900s. We're talking around 1906, I believe. And it didn't end until 1975. When Sweden became kind of a vassal of the Third Reich, the Swedes became very fanatical for eugenics. And even before the Nazis took power in Germany, the Swedes were conducting a pretty horrific policy of forced sterilization, sterilizing people who are considered to be inferior. And even after the Second World War, Sweden refused to get rid of its eugenic policy. It kept it. And then in 1975, it officially disbanded the policy. But considering that history, you have to really ask yourself, do these things just go away? And they don't. When you have a country that has, for so many decades, held on to a Darwinistic ideology, these things just don't go away. It's like watching the Ottoman Empire fall and expecting to see Islamic fundamentalism disappear, or Sufi Islamic imperialistic ideology disappear. It just doesn't happen. And these things rear their ugly heads. And I think that coronavirus has really, the coronavirus crisis has been used as an opportunity for eugenists to do these sorts of Darwinistic and murderous activities, really.
Yes.
Because the majority of the people killed in Sweden due to coronavirus are elderly people. And the hospitals never even reached 80% capacity. So there was plenty of room for elderly people in Sweden. They still refused to accept them. When they did accept them, they would put them through very unstable medical care. In other words, it wasn't consistent, and it wasn't really for their benefit, and it wasn't secure. It wasn't stable. And now, but when I did these videos on Sweden last month, I did 2 videos on Sweden last month, people were upset with me. People were saying that I didn't know what I was talking about. There were people from Sweden writing me, telling me that I didn't know what I was talking about and that Sweden doesn't have euthanasia. But I stuck to my opinion because I understand some of the history, and I understand that many times when governments want to implement murderous policies, they do so with indirect methods. So they don't put a bullet in your head, but they'll deprive you of care and let you die.
Yes.
But then yesterday there was a number of reports coming out, one from the BBC, and then there was some others. There was one from LifeSite News and some other sites, essentially saying that Sweden is directly murdering people, not just indirectly murdering them, but directly murdering them. Because these people have coronavirus, which means that their respiratory system is already compromised. So under such a weakened respiratory system, they inject these people with morphine and Haldol, which we know for a fact restricts breathing, and it kills them.
Yes.
And we know for a fact now that nurses lie to the patients when they say, "What are you injecting me with?" The nurses will say, "Oh, it's just some, medicine to help you," but it's really morphine because they want to kill you.
Yes.
So what we're seeing in Sweden is a eugenic policy against the elderly, a Darwinistic policy against the elderly that is being done by a first world country, a fully developed country, and it's considered to be completely legal. And by many people, it's considered to be ethical. So what we're seeing in Sweden, I think, is a foreshadower of the things to come. There's a verse in the Bible that we like to quote a lot in Shoebat.com. It's from the Book of Wisdom. I understand that most people in the United States aren't really familiar with the Book of Wisdom because it's not in the mainstream Protestant Bibles, but it is in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles.
Yes.
And it was actually in the Protestant Bible for a very long time. It was originally in the King James Bible for a very long time, but it was removed a while later, I think by the Puritans, if I'm not mistaken. But in the Book of Wisdom, it says, it has a quote from the wicked, it gives an example of how the evil people talk.
I can read it. Can I read it?
Yeah.
All right. This is from Wisdom chapter 2, verses 12 to 23. And look how close it is to explaining what we see. This is from our paths, as from things impure, he calls blessed the destiny of the righteous. Speaking of Christ, and it's also emanating what the seed of Christ, the followers of Christ say. Okay. And boast that God is his father. Well, Christ says God is his father. We also say, our Father who art in heaven. So let us see whether his words be true. Let us find out what will happen to him in the end, and that is genocide. For if the righteous one is the Son of God, God will help him and deliver him from the hands of his foes. In other words, the church emulates what happened to Christ on the cross. If he was truly the Son of God, let him bring himself down from the cross, okay? With violence and torture, that is death camp or camps, expect severe persecution in this era. Let us put him to the test that we may have proof of his gentleness and try his patience. Let us condemn him to a shameful death. That's mass genocide. For according to his own words, God will take care of him. These were their thoughts, but they erred, God says. For their wickedness blinded them, and they did not know the hidden counsels of God. Neither did they count on a recompense for holiness, nor discern the innocent souls. I'm speaking about many people here, innocent souls. They couldn't understand the mindset of a Christian, or all Christians in this case. Okay, for God formed us to be imperishable, the image of his own nature. He made us. But by the envy of the devil, death entered the world, and they who are allied with him experienced it. Now,
So the verse has a quote trying to demonstrate how evil people talk. And it gives an example. And in this quote, it says, "But let our might be our law of right." Might makes right. This is really the whole underpinning creed of social Darwinism. Might makes right and survival of the fittest. And then it says, "For what is weak proves itself to be useless." And then it says before that, "Let us oppress the righteous poor man. Let us not spare the widow or regard the gray hairs of the aged." In other words, kill the elderly.
Yes.
This is the only verse in the Bible that really describes an evil, deliberate plan to murder elderly people.
and if I may add, you know, the prophecy in context and wisdom, you know, 2:12 to 23, let us lie in wait for the righteous one because he is annoying to us. So in other words, the Christian is annoying to the non-Christians,
Yes.
the eugenists, the evolutionists. They don't like Christians. You know, that's why you see, there's a Cuomo in New York, he says, anybody who is anti-abortion, we don't want you here, you know. And so Christians are annoying in those cities. He oppresses our actions. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Reproaches us for transgressions of the law. Wow. You breaking God's law, you know, whether it's the homosexual agenda, whether it's the abortion agenda, whether it's the euthanasia, you know, hey, that's murder. You know, Christians are always pointing murder, you know, you're killing, that's killing a human being. And charge us with violations of our training. Now that's very interesting. He charges us with violation of our training. You know, in this case, doctors who are killing elderly people. You know, hey, didn't you give the Hippocratic oath or whatever? You know, he's supposed to be saving mankind. He professes to have knowledge of God and styles himself a child of the Lord. To us, he is the censors of our thought. He wants to censor us, the Christian.
Yes.
Merely to see him is a hardship for us because his life is not like that of others, and different are his ways. He judges us debased. He holds aloof from our paths as from things impure. He calls blessed the destiny of the righteous and boasts that God is his father. You see, then it continues, you know, let us see if this is true. So then they begin to condemn him to shameful death, and then they disrespect the elderly and all these things. Well, it's exactly what we're beginning to witness.
Yes.
You know, and you know, we look at a lot of these verses in the Bible. We see, you know, it's speaking of one certain individual. See, that's Christ. But at times, yes, it is. But it gets confusing because then it hears us, multiple, you know, plural, many people here. Is this Christ or is this the church? And people tend to get confused about this because what they don't understand is that, you know, the church is a corporate entity.
Yes.
You know, it doesn't stand alone. Without Christ, there's no church. He's the head of that body. And so when he says, just as you did to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. Wow. So it's a corporate entity. It's not just this individualistic Western attitude about the church, you know, my interpretation, or it's my, you know, it's my way or the highway. It's just, it's interesting how, you know, we look at prophecies about one individual and it really pertains to multitudes of things.
Yes.
So Ted, do you have more to continue?
So the fact that we see of eugenics being done, a social Darwinistic policy being done in Sweden, it really, I think, foreshadows what is to come. It gives us an idea. We're seeing the beginning of it. We are seeing the beginning of it. And I think one thing that we should look at is the younger generations. I'm not talking millennials. I'm talking Generation Z, or also known as Zoomers, and also Generation Alpha. Because you have Generation X, and then you have Generation Y, which is the millennials, and then you have Generation Z. So there's no more letters of the alphabet to use, so now we're using Greek terms.
Yeah.
So we have Generation Z, Zoomers, and then Alphas. Zers are people, or Zoomers are people who were born in the mid-90s, so 1995 to somewhere within the 2010s. And then you have Alphas who were born within the 2010s. The Alphas, they weren't born, they weren't even existing in the post 9/11 world, where, you know, there was this huge obsession with terrorism and homeland security. There was a huge fixation on the subject of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism. Zoomers were way too young to even remember that. Millennials, on the other hand, we do remember that, because we were all in junior high or high school when 9/11 happened. And when you look at the political interests of millennial voters as opposed to Zoomers, or Alphas are way too young to even vote, so they're irrelevant in this context. But when you look at Zoomers don't care about terrorism. But when you look at millennials, 30% of millennials in one poll said that terrorism was a serious issue for them. So this attention on terrorism is dying out. People don't really care so much about this as much.
Yeah.
The focus on Israel, that is becoming gradually obscure. People are caring less and less about it. The boomer generation cares a lot about Israel. Millennials, so. Gen Xers, yeah, there's a lot of support for Israel. But then you come to, or there's a substantial at least, but then you come to Zoomers who are now in their early 20s and they don't care about Israel.
Yes.
So, and another thing that we can expect to see is America becoming less relevant in global policy, in directing the world. America is a global hegemony. It is the global hegemony. It's the reason why America is in such a rivalry with Russia, because Russia is a country that also is a hegemony that's not completely under the control of the United States. But as far as most of the world, America is the #1 global hegemony right now. But that's gradually deteriorating. The United States, not so much controlling the European Union. The United States allowing Germany to become more militaristic. The United States allowing Turkey to take control of Syria. This is a very big thing.
Yes, it is.
For example, Donald Trump told Erdogan in a phone conversation, Syria is all yours. And when Donald Trump in his campaign said, I'm going to not focus on Syria anymore, I don't want to get involved in any sort of interventionism in Syria anymore, what he really meant was allowing Turkey to take control of Syria, because that's what's happening.
Yes.
The United States allowing Japan to become more militarily independent. Japan is now working on creating its own military technology. Germany is also taking this path. Turkey is also taking this path. What we're seeing is America reducing itself as a global hegemony, and other global or other regional powerhouses like Japan, like Turkey, like Germany, now expanding themselves and really making themselves more powerful at a global level. This is why there's so much talk right now within the German government about making Germany a global player in foreign policy and making the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, great again, making the German military something to be reckoned with, something to be feared again.
Yes.
And Germany is talking about making nuclear weapons. Japan has also been talking about this. There is a document from the US Congress, it's from 2008, and it essentially says that if Japan and Germany ever get the impression that America doesn't care about protecting them anymore, Japan and Germany will create nuclear weapons for themselves.
Yes.
It says it quite emphatically. And the United States is doing just that. It's saying, you guys pay for your own protection. Trump even said during his campaign, if Japan wants to get nukes and nuke North Korea, well, so be it.
Mhm.
And this is unprecedented, what he said.
Yes.
Essentially saying that, hey, America's not really going to focus on protecting your country for you. You can do it for yourself. And once you see that sort of thing happening, it's essentially unleashing a bunch of rabid dogs.
Yes.
And so when Israel becomes less relevant to American society, that's also very dangerous. And I've criticized the state of Israel several times. There's nothing wrong with legitimate criticism, but there is something wrong with taking down established policies and not really worrying about the consequences, because Israel does serve a purpose in the Middle East. It is America's foothold in the Middle East, and it's America's way of controlling the Middle East. And if America begins to no longer care about Israel, the geopolitical consequences of that, I think, are very dangerous. Because then what happens is, well, if Israel's not getting backed by the US and Israel weakens, then you have other regional powers in the Middle East that will feel empowered, like Turkey, like Iran. And you have a very volatile situation. The same thing goes with Europe. Right now, the EU is, for the most part, dependent on the United States for protection, because it's, Germany is in NATO. And one thing about NATO is that NATO countries have to protect themselves. But when the Trump administration insists, well, Germany, you have to pay your fair share, there was a German politician by the name of Andreas Nick who said, not only are we going to pay 2% of our GDP for our own national security, we're actually going to go over that. We're going to pay 3-4% of our GDP for our military now. And so as the United States gives that message to the Europeans that we're not really going to help you anymore, we're no longer going to protect you anymore, that then gives the incentive to countries like Germany to boost their military. Same thing with Turkey and Japan.
Yeah.
There is a plan that a lot of these countries have for the year 2027. Turkey has talked about this, that by the year 2027, its military is going to be a lot more advanced than it is now. Japan has also talked about these sorts of things. Hungary has said by 2027, their military is going to be more advanced than what it already is. And in fact, Turkey has agreed to ramp up Hungary's military. And Germany has also pointed out to the year 2027. So something's going to happen in the late 2020s. And when the year 2020 first came, January 1st, I did a video about what to expect for the decade of the 20s. When we say the 20s, we think like the roaring 20s, but we're kind of living in our own 1920s now.
Yes.
And I said, expect the decade of the 20s to be a decade of mass military preparation, where countries are going to be building up their militaries in preparation for a massive global conflict.
Yes.
So by 2027, these countries are going to be very militarily strong, very efficient, especially when you're talking about a country like Germany. It's technologically a very, very advanced country. And by the year 2029, Generation Alpha is going to be pretty much close to military recruitment age. 2030 comes, they're going to be 19 years old, 20 years old. Perfect age for military recruitment. So I think what's happened, and in fact, they have done numerous studies and observations and and analysis on what to expect from the Zoomers and the Alphas. One thing we can expect, a massive favor for socialism. And that's very dangerous, because when you have a lot of people believing in socialism, what do you have? You have some people going to the far left socialism, which is communism.
Yes.
And then you have other people who are of a more, let's say, right-wing nationalistic persuasion, who will go to National Socialism, which is essentially Nazism.
Yes.
Basically, left-wing socialism is socialism for all of the workers of the world. Now, you don't always see this sort of thing. Like, for example, the Khmer Rouge murdered anyone who was Chinese or Vietnamese. So it's not, the lines are blurred between the two groups, but I'm just giving you a general assessment of it. And then you have the right-wing socialism, which is socialism for our people. That's essentially the two differences. I understand you can find exceptions to the rule, but this is essentially the general explanation of this. So that's the danger. And then there is another thing that's going to take place, and I've read reports on this and articles on this, that one thing to expect is also a boost in nationalism. In fact, the Zoomers are expected to be more right-wing than the millennials.
Wow.
This is one thing that's being expected from the Zoomers. In fact, we're already seeing this with Zoomers on the internet. But if you look at the Zoomers politically speaking, they're on both sides. They are very, very insidious. It's either left wing or it's right wing. Both very dangerous. And one thing we can expect from the Alphas is also nationalism, regionalism, localism, and the coronavirus crisis is actually helping this phenomena, because what coronavirus is doing is it's forcing people to remain local.
Yes.
It's also forcing people to think about their own country, to not really think about, the global world and globalization. So it's making people more protectionist, more nationally focused.
Yes.
And that can be a good thing, but the problem is that people are very politically not. How do I say it in a nice way? People can be easily veered to something evil and destructive.
Yes.
And so you're seeing the fascist elements of the world using the coronavirus situation to percolate, to influence people for the certain ideology. And another thing I want to add, and then I'll stop talking. Another thing that we can also see is a discussion on who deserves to live, right? Are elderly people considered important? Like, we're talking a lot about essential workers, right? So Sweden said essentially that, well, the reason why we deprive these elderly people of medical care is because, well, they're not really essential for society. And this opens up a big Pandora's box. Because once you say, well, these people are not essential for society, they don't contribute anything materially to society, then they deserve to die.
Yes.
If that's being done to the elderly, then it's going to be done to people who are handicapped, people who are mentally handicapped, people who are who have disabilities, and that opens the road to something very destructive.
If I may add, Brexit, will encourage regional and separatist movement. It's already happening. In the other European countries, not just in, it's not an issue of just Great Britain, which is probably the closest ally to the United States in Europe. So Europe's aging population will undermine the economic output shift. It shifts the consumption towards services like healthcare, because the elderly people want healthcare. So the healthcare becomes the greatest kind of economic issue of the day. And so the elderly people with this healthcare crisis needs an answer. So they want to shift towards goods and investments. They want, stuff.
Yes.
They don't want this whole focus on healthcare. And so this coronavirus is really opening this in a major way. Say, okay, so what are we going to, we're going to lose our economy. That's why I say, you got to come out of your houses because you need the economy. Some people even denying really the coronavirus is a major issue. Just the economy, is the economy stupid. And so with that mentality, is the economy stupid? And this, worry about the healthcare system. What are they going to do with the elderly? Well, the answer is euthanasia. So this will cause basically Europe to soon resort to, the idea of euthanasia. And we see it already happening in Sweden. In fact, you should put up maybe a clip, maybe Ted could send you a clip of this woman talking about her, elderly as a father, how he died and how they suffered. They shoot them, they inject them with Haldol, a combo of Haldol and morphine. And then this poor elderly person is there, doesn't even know what's happening to them. And they suffocate and they struggle and they start hallucinating because of the Haldol, and then they just die. It's just really, literally murdering the elderly in Sweden. And so, the shortage of younger workers, we have a problem in Europe. There's a shortage of younger workers. That basically reduces the tax revenue. If everybody's old, who's going to retire? Who's going to be paying the taxes? This it fuels this anger towards, also immigration. There's this migrant crisis that fuels anger too. And so this anger against the migrant crisis and the mistrust of the elites, you have armchair revolutionary. Who do you think these people who really orchestrated Brexit? Farage. And,
well, if I can add something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because you brought up.
But let me just finish my thought here. So what's that going to do? With this migrant crisis and all that stuff, this is going to cause this Zoomer generation, as Ted calls it, into two things: populism,
Yes.
isolationism, which is really protectionism, and ultranationalism. And what we're seeing really is about to happen is a perfect storm, or we have a plague, and that's what's going to get them into what Isaiah the prophet predicted: nation rise against nation, neighbor against neighbor, city against city. We see it in America already, between blacks and whites, and this whole madness taking down, statues of historic figures in America. So go ahead, Ted.
Well, you brought up Brexit and eugenics. I just want to say that the mastermind behind Brexit wasn't Nigel Farage, and it wasn't Boris Johnson. It was actually a guy by the name of Dominic Cummings. And Dominic Cummings is considered to be the mastermind, the leading strategist behind pushing Brexit and making it something very popular amongst the voters in Great Britain. And I spent a number of days looking at the work of Dominic Cummings, and I found, article after article after article by this guy promoting eugenics, literally promoting the idea of social Darwinism and eugenics. And he makes it very clear that one of his goals behind Brexit is to eventually implement a policy in Great Britain of eugenics, of social Darwinism. Because he says that the problem with Great Britain is that there's too much political correctness. Too much political correctness. We can't have Darwinistic ideas being promoted if we have political correctness, because it's taboo to talk about how certain people are inferior to others. And so the fact that the mastermind behind Brexit is a eugenist should raise a bunch of red flags.
Yes.
The problem is that it didn't, because people think, well, these people are amazing patriots and we should follow them.
That's what's going to be also the response. I mean, right now, you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and anybody says anything, even John Wayne's airport got to be renamed something else because John Wayne said something in his lifetime,
Yes.
This whole idea of kind of, we run society by memes or very short statements and very narrow-mindedness. But you see, the African Americans who are really kind of going towards that agenda of, can't say anything about blacks or whatever, they're causing a problem in the future, because eventually that kind of silencing or political correctness, as Ted called it. It's going to have a response. It's going to be no longer politically, incorrect to address the issue of eugenics. And so if the issue of eugenics becomes very popular, which it is, what do the African Americans think is going to happen to them? So that's why I always think that the African American always being set up for something that hates him more, And so we have to be careful of the most popular cliches that are out there, We need to go beyond the cliches and the memes. People are uneducated, and Jesus warned, my people are destroyed for the lack of knowledge. And so where is this going to end? God is going to begin to look at the whole earth and say who is and who is not uncircumcised.
Yes.
Now there's two ways to look at this word uncircumcised or circumcised in the Bible. There's only two ways. There's whether to look at it fleshly, where the Muslim says that he's circumcised. The Jew objects about the Muslim circumcision. He says it's not halachically true circumcision. But God is talking about the circumcision of the heart. So he's going to do what? And if I share just Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 25 to 26, finally God will have enough.
Yes.
He says, behold, the days come, says the Lord, that I will punish all them which are circumcised with the uncircumcised. So it rains in the good and the bad and the ugly. Unfortunately, the church also will endure the wrath to come. The circumcised with the uncircumcised. Egypt and Judah and Edom, well, Judah is Israel, Egypt, is he speaking allegorically here of the paganized, the pagan Egypt of the world? Is he speaking of Egypt?
Yes.
I think it could be literally Egypt, it could be the greater Egypt. Judah and Edom and the children of Ammon and Moab. Moab is of his father. That's what it means, min Abba. So, or the ones of their own father, not from the God the Father. Is this speaking allegorically? It could. And all that, the utmost corners, basically the earth, that dwell in the wilderness far away. For all these nations are uncircumcised. God is angry because they're not circumcised at the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always have to understand when we read the scriptures is that God is speaking of greater things. As we spoke last time, me and you, he said, Jesus is of the order of Melchizedek, or Melchizedek, as you say in English. Melchizedek is two words, the king of righteousness,
Yes.
whose generations is unknown. In other words, he's a Canaani, he's from Canaan, and no one knows his generations. So spiritually, Christ has no generations. He's in other words, he says, I'm from the order of a Hamite.
Yes.
And that really will upset the Judaizers of the world. They would say, wait a minute, the Messiah has a lineage. Well, yes, that's his earthly lineage. So we have to determine the difference between the earth and the spirit. And that's the bottom line. And so earthly, that's why Paul warns us, Jerusalem earthly, it's equal with Arabia. Judah is being punished right there. So why is Judah punished? I thought God loves, Judah. Yeah, he does. But again, look at the situation in Israel. There's homosexuality. There's all kinds of problems. Bisexuality is one of the top in the world in Israel. And so God is fed up. He's dealing with this paganized world, where people just get into all sorts of things. Everybody has their own mind. In fact, maybe we should talk about next time, the Book of Wisdom, where they think that the truth emanates from their heart.
Yes.
And truth doesn't emanate from man's heart. it emanates only by connecting to the corporate entity of God.
Yes.
And that is the meeting between heaven and earth. In other words, it's heavenly. And so we must embrace ourselves, especially in the times that are coming. Every day you hear of things and you go like, what? You just can't believe what you're hearing. You know, how could a nation suffering a pandemic, yet they're having unrest on the streets,
Yes.
and they're not even considering they have a plague.
Mhm.
You know, Fauci today says today we have it's going to average 100,000 infections a day. You look at America's chart and it's like, boop.
Yes.
It's insane.
It's insanity what we see. And now Europe says, hey, no Americans. Nobody wants Americans.
I'm telling you, because people are becoming more localized.
Exactly.
People are becoming more nationalistic, more regionalistic.
Yes. So the coronavirus is creating a perfect storm. And with this turmoil that we see, we're getting closer by the day. So as Ted says, stay tuned.
Another thing I want to add also is in the middle of this pandemic, it's very interesting that there's a couple of things that we can see happening, like geopolitically. We see Turkey encroaching more and more further into the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yes.
During this whole pandemic, everyone's focusing on the virus, and we should be focusing on the virus. But Turkey is taking advantage of all the attention that is being made towards the coronavirus as the distraction to do what it wants. Turkey is being allowed by the US to basically expand into Libya and into the Eastern Mediterranean. And then you have another thing happening in the Middle East. Netanyahu wants to annex the West Bank, wants to take 30% of the West Bank. This is very serious.
Yes, it is.
It's very serious because it's gonna be a catalyst to certain things. One, it's gonna intensify anti-Semitism. And when I say that, I don't mean to say like, well, the Jews deserve it. What I'm saying is a lot of people already hate the Jews. When we think of hatred to the Jews, we think of, well, Muslims, Middle Eastern people don't like Jews. But one thing that we need to be mentally prepared for is a phenomena which hasn't really been around for over 7 decades or so. And I'm talking about Western hatred for the Jews. Basically, Western man, Europeans, North Americans, hating Jews. Europeans, yeah. We're going to be seeing more hatred against the Jews in the Western world. And that connects with what I said earlier in the interview about America gradually not caring about Israel as the younger generations get older and start becoming more influential in politics. Another thing that this is going to cause is I think it's going to set a very dangerous precedent for countries that don't like each other. So Israel annexes the West Bank. Bunch of Palestinians who are living there, they're harvesting fruits and vegetables in the Jordan Valley. Israel takes over the Jordan Valley, puts a bunch of military bases there. A bunch of people lose their land. A bunch of people can't access their crops any longer. And there's going to be, for one thing, an international outcry against it.
Yes.
The Palestinians are going to launch another intifada. They're going to launch a third intifada. And the Palestinians are already talking about this. Like, if Israel wants to take the Jordan Valley, they expect bullets. So you're going to see that. But then you're going to have other countries saying, wait a second. If Israel can take territory, why can't we?
Yes.
So let's say, so for example, there's a territorial dispute between Germany and Russia. They don't talk about it a lot, but there is. It's if you look at a map of Europe, there is an area that borders right with Poland. It's called Kaliningrad.
Mhm.
And it's actually a territory of Russia. But originally it was a territory of Germany. The Russians took it. So let's say Germany says, you know what? We want to take Kaliningrad. Well, you can't do that. Why not? You supported Israel taking Palestinian land.
Mhm.
Or let's say Japan and Russia have a territorial dispute over the Sakhalin. Sakhalin is a region of land that is right in between Japan and the rest of Russia.
Yes.
Originally, it belonged to Japan. Well, the Japanese took it from Russia when Japan defeated Russia in 1905. There was a war between Japan and Russia in the early 1900s. And then near the end of the Second World War, Russia, you know, being with the Allies, also went to war against Japan and took the Sakhalin back. And ever since then, the Sakhalin has belonged to Russia. Japan still thinks that the Sakhalin belongs to them. So let's say Japan says, you know what, we're going to invade the Sakhalin. Well, you can't do that, Japan. Why not? You supported Israel taking 30% of the West Bank. So it's going to set a dangerous example that could act as it could spark a very destructive ripple effect around the world.
Yes.
Israel made a mistake. In 1967, 6 Days War, that was their chance to include all Judea, what they call Judea, to Israel proper. In other words, make it one state. And then give the Palestinians citizenship. Or say, okay, you can have citizenship, or you can join this Palestinian, you know, every Palestinian in Israel proper has a citizenship, an Israeli citizenship. None of them want to join this Palestinian state because they know it's not a better life for them. Israel is kind of mimics the US in the way they live. And so the problem essentially is this, is that Israel fears that the melting pot will diminish the Jewishness of Israel. In other words, it's the nationalistic fear. You know, Palestinians want their Arabization. They want to be Arab, and the Jews wants it to be Jewish. And so this fear, and plus there is a nationalistic sentiment.
Yes.
And so the problem is this ultra-nationalist sentiment. You know, we don't want Arabs to be into Israel proper. And so that creates the animosity. And so you have this, you know, if you tell the Jewish people in Israel what I'm saying, they don't like me. If you tell the Palestinians what I'm saying, they hate me. They want me dead. So I remember even, you know, going to New York and visiting with, you know, funders and think they said, no, you're supposed to implement a Palestinian state. I says, well, it's going to be a state that's going to be hostile towards you. So this is the problem. The problem is the ultra-nationalist mentality of people. You see that in Serbia, you see that in all over the place, and this isolationist and this, you know, today there's only like two choices. You're either for Black Lives Matter or you're not, you know. You can't be in the middle.
Yes.
You can't say, hey, you know, I respect Black Lives Matter. I respect the rights of Black, you know, Americans not to be mistreated by the police. But in the other essence, I also respect the police. Yeah, sure. Instead of just, we lump people up. We just lump everything. Oh, the police, okay? You know, do you, and let me ask anybody there, you know, if you have a rotten apple in your tree, do you cut the tree?
Right.
And so today's mentality is so crazy. Oh, there's a rotten apple in the tree, cut the whole tree. There's rotten apples everywhere. There's a rabbi who says a fingernail of a Jew's worth 1,000 Arabs. But there's 100 rabbis who condemn that rabbi.
Yes.
But you don't find the same essence in the Palestinian side, you know, where Palestinian blows up a pizzeria where a bunch of Jews die.
Yes.
You don't find other Palestinians condemning that Palestinians. You find them marching in the street, you know, with a martyr's procession. And so the bottom line is, this is, I think you know this already, is this is why we began to kind of direct our view in just very simple way to look at things. Good versus evil.
Yes.
And we don't decide what's good. We don't decide what's evil. We take a look at the situation and we say, what did Christ say? Christ says the Samaritan was good. That Hasidic Jew,
Right.
who was going to his Sabbath, he was bad. He didn't help his neighbor. And so who's my neighbor? You know, you think in your mind, your neighbor is your next door neighbor. Is no. Let me tell you what a neighbor is. You know, a man goes to Jericho and he sees the situation. So just imagine taking things the way Christ thought. You know, we're taking all the words in the Bible. We find the word neighbor and we analyze that word neighbor the way Christ analyzed neighbor.
Yes.
We analyze every word the way Christ analyzed it. Now what do we get? We get the Bible telling us so many things. We just don't see it, you know. We don't see it because we look by the flesh. We operate by the flesh. And that's the problem. Once you operate by the flesh, you always think the flesh is, okay, lust of the flesh, this kind of thing. Yeah, that's flesh too. But when we think fleshly and not spiritually, that's when we run into trouble. And that's why we see the world in serious trouble.
Yes. I think of the scripture that's been left out of the Protestant Bibles too, of Sirach chapter 2, where in a nutshell it says that when you prepare to become a follower of Christ, prepare yourself for ordeal in a time of refinement. And I think that's where we find ourselves as Christians in the days ahead, as a time of refinement, a time of leanness that you speak about, as we're living in Mystery Babylon.
And that refinement, as you correctly said, comes through fire as fire refines gold. And so expect pain. You know, a woman having a child is pain, but the end is joy. And the birth pangs increase by the day. And so we are entering into birth pangs, you know. And the Bible tells us the uncurable disease.
Yes.
And, you know, and we worry about the economy. You know, look at Corona. It's either the economy or we stay home. If we stay home, we're gonna lose the economy. But if you go to work, you're gonna get sick. 100,000 a day in America. And then God interjects, and look what God says. In Isaiah 24:25, behold, the Lord makes the earth empty and makes it waste, distorts its surface and scatters abroad its inhabitants. And it shall be as with the people, so with the priest, as with the servant, so with the master, as with the maid, so with the mistress, as with the buyer, so with the seller, as with the lender, so with the borrower, as with the creditor, so with the debtor. It's all going to collapse.
Yes. Yes. That's why we have to keep bringing these teachings out and help people get their mindset correct for the days ahead, because we're here.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that that this whole COVID crisis is teaching us is how we are actually not as united as we may have thought we were as a country. If you look at, for example, coronavirus in the West Bank, Palestinians had very little COVID-19 cases because Palestinians work more as a community. So, for example, they say that you could find Palestinian men sleeping in their cars after work because they were afraid that if they went into their homes, they could infect their families with coronavirus. It's just that level of community awareness that helped that society out a lot. It benefited that society. Whereas in the US, we really don't see ourselves as a community. We see ourselves as a giant economy where our lives have to be dedicated to the nation's GDP. And one thing I hope that COVID-19 could bring about is people trying to at least cultivate some sort of community awareness. But even if you have that, the problem is it would most likely be co-opted by socialists.
Yeah.
So you can never escape the human virus.
No.
Yeah, you know, I think also people are not content. I don't understand. You know, I mean, what's for lunch? You know, okra, eggplant, because Ted plants okra and eggplant.
Yeah.
For months we've been living on okra eggplant, and I'm still living, and so garden. What's wrong with gardening? And change your way of thinking. That you have, Americans have a pattern, and I'm sure you do.
Yes.
You got to go to the drive-through. Where do you prefer to go?
Totally.
Confess your sin to everybody now, loud.
Nice Chipotle. At least it is healthy, clean food.
Chipotle, yeah. So you have a pattern. You got to go to Chipotle, and so you can't get out of the pattern, And so what needs to happen is get out of the pattern, and eat what the earth is providing you. What's providing? Ted, what do we have there? We go to the garden, we find what we have, and we eat it.
Yes.
Common mellow. If I tell you what I have in the garden, it's probably going to take several pages. But all sorts of herbs and things like that. And guess what? You really get healthier. And so it's simplify your life. Be frugal. Think in your mind, tomorrow the banks are shut. Everything's going to collapse. What am I going to do? The ones that are prepared is like the 5 virgins were prepared. Preparedness, as far as the 10 virgins, isn't just an issue of spiritual preparedness, but it's literal preparedness. Jesus is simply giving you an example. Hey, some were prepared, some were not. Jesus himself condemned his time for not knowing the time of the visitation.
Yes.
And so we're not ignorant that we shouldn't kind of say, hey, it's around the corner. We see it happening, and to be prepared and ready.
Yeah. Well done today, gentlemen. That was a great episode, number 7. We'll resume this again next Wednesday for episode 8. We thank you again for your time and your diligence in searching for truth and the clarity that you bring about in God's word and explaining what's going on in the world. God bless, and we'll talk to you next week.
God
God
bless.
bless.